Welcome everyone to Fascinating Futurisms, Squatsy and Howdy. I am Lee Francis the Fourth, your proprietor for this evening here, presented to you by Wordcraft Circle in collaboration with the tribe called Geek. Wordcraft Circle is a 30-year-old, 35-year-old organization dedicated to promoting the works and words of Native and Indigenous writers and storytellers throughout the world. We are very excited to be able to continue this wonderful talk series here into 2021. This Fascinating Futurisms is supported by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Humanities Council. Of course, we always like to point out that any of the views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the New Mexico Humanities Council. But we're going to have a really good, swinging, fantastic conversation about Indigenous futurisms, nerditry, and everything in between. If you haven't been able to join us live this evening, as we are taping this, filming this, zooming this, however you want to put it, you can always catch it on our website, A Tribe Called Geek, and or Wordcraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers. We've been able to partner with the Tribe Called Geek to be able to promote and showcase some of these wonderful, fascinating futurisms. So you'll be able to find more of these videos there on that fantastic site, and all sorts of great content. So I am super thrilled to invite the first of three guests. I'm doing this to Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, so we're doing these three in a row this week. The first of our guests, Weyodi Old Bear, thank you so much for joining me. You are an incredible writer, futurist, just writer. You write everything in between. Yeah, I'm so glad you're here. So thank you. Welcome to Fascinating Futurisms.
Well, thank you. You are too kind, entirely too kind, and I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah. This is wonderful. I know we'll get the chance to talk about a lot of things, but if you want to take the time, I always try to make Native folks uncomfortable by talking about yourself at the beginning of the show so you can get it out of the way. So if you want to do a little bit of an intro and tell us about some of your, your exploits and some of the cool things, because I'm going to talk about them later. So that's fine. I'll definitely add that to it. But if you'd like to as well, to start the engines, then by all means, if you want to give a little intro.
Well, you do know how to make an Indigenous person uncomfortable. Because all of our tribe, pretty much every tribe I know, you're really not supposed to tell people what you're doing. You got to wait for somebody else to do that. In fact, it's so bad with Comanches when they used to send us out, war parties out. Most people would have a partner they were going with, and their partner was supposed to report on their deeds, as I was told, that their war partner was supposed to, and if they screwed up, tell, and if they did something great, brag on their behalf. So
I like that. I think we should all do that.
Yeah,
that's a much better way to work this world, right? Like if somebody's just like, you bring your buddy around and be like, and not even like telling you whether not to do that, just saying like, I'm just going to tell people about it. So you should probably think about that before you decide to jump into this one, dude, just to let you know. So, well, I always like to let everybody get the chance to introduce how they want to introduce. So I will brag on you later, because you could basically just be like, hi, I'm Weyodi. I like Batman. And that could be the end. There it is, right?
That's not mine. That's my husband's.
Awesome.
I have this argument about, we discuss Batman, whether, he's a rich guy with too much power, or whether, anyway, we have a lot of discussions. I'm more of I really like Swamp Thing and John Constantine.
Yep, nice. Swamp Thing, illustrated by Tim Truman. Had a couple of points in there, so well done. Excellent work. One of our fan favorites. So so tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm voting Namana, citizen of the Comanche Nation. I had a pretty traditional upbringing with my very traditional grandmother who developed the curriculum for one of the first tribal cultural camps, and was a family court judge who really pioneered in holding state judges' feet to the fire when it came to ICWA. And before that was a cartographer for the Soil and Moisture Conservation Office. And so I learned a lot from her about land, and she was, as you can imagine, deeply immersed in our culture and grew up around Comanche people, and also aware of the politics, and all of that goes into my writing. And I spent 15 years taking care of her when she suffered from dementia as an older person.
Right.
So that's how traditional I am. Anyway, or I was brought up, and also traditional in that I'm very progressive, and I'm looking to the future, which I feel like our ancestors, no one could be as radical and as forward thinking as our ancestors were. So I try to express that in my writing. And I'm really interested in the past and the present and the future, and how they all kind of go together. How we view the past shapes how we imagine the future.
Right.
And the really bad stereotypes about our past and about our cultures. Notice that there's an S on that word. About indigenous cultures, plural. Those bad stereotypes kind of limit, in this system that we have, that is a really white supremacist system, and it has been a white supremacist system, or else you would see people from all cultures and all nations and of all colors in positions of power, and not just in positions of power, but you would see their worldviews represented. So it is a white supremacist system. And part of how it works is by misrepresenting our cultures. And having those 1950s Western stereotypes still persisting,
right,
in the minds of people today, in the minds of mainstream culture today. Anyway, so for me, I think part of being an indigenous indigenous futurist and writing science fiction with a Numina viewpoint is about kind of breaking that down, getting rid of that, and getting rid of that, and in replacing it with a real, Numina point of view. And also, this is, we have two science fictions. We have, I was just thinking about this. There are two science fictions that exist. There's kind of a mainstream science fiction that's kind of a gee whiz, rockets, jetpacks, domed city, kind of, you know what I mean, kind of thing that we're seeing, kind of cowboys with laser guns, laser pistols thing. And then there's the really weird science fiction that talks about the nature of death, the nature of the universe, what gender is. You can see this by reading like Octavia Butler, Samuel Delaney. There's a lot of the really weird science fiction out there that is just amazing and was formative to me too.
I would posit that that's actually even more like the OG science fiction, right? Because if you go back to Asimov, I think it's a lot of the ways in which we talk about like country, right? There's like the OG roots of country, Hank Williams, right? All the way back, the original stuff, and then it, and then the commercialized things, right? And I have no problems with, laser swords and, you know, and Wookiees and whatnot. They're fantastic, but it's not necessarily looking at that premise of science fiction. I think, you know, kind of where your aim in is, and influential for me as well, was that it was like, it talked about, you know, fundamental dilemmas, logic arguments, you know, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to exist? How do you, you know, how are you dealing with, you know, concepts of death or concepts of replacement or concepts of, you know, identity, right? I think that, except set in space, because it's a great way to be able to do it, right? You can, or set in some sort of strange locale where you know, it's, how is it put? Where these types of locations are fascinating for us as the reader, but not for the people living in it, right? It's our true writing mantra, right? It's a show, not tell, right? We're showing because they're living this, rather than being like, oh, this is obviously surprising for Jim to be in this crazy world where robots exist. Oh, Jim is surprised. You know, it's just like, man, at that point, Jim's just going about his day being like, yo, robot one, hey, robot two, nice to meet you. Try not to murder me in my sleep. Thanks. You know, so yeah, I think that's a great setup. So that begs the question, which I will lead into, as we have everybody do. What is your definition of indigenous futurisms? How do you put some words to that? Phrases.
Well, I think that any person who is not a settler in their home, who is writing science fiction set in the future, or who is writing a story set in the future, because it can have, you know, be more science. Well, you know, Clarke's second law, or no, is it Clarke or Sturgeon's second law? No, Sturgeon's law is 98% of everything is crap. Clarke's second law is any sufficiently advanced technology is virtually indistinguishable from magic.
Yep.
And so any story by an indigenous person set in the future is indigenous futurisms. Because I believe that any person can't help, regardless of their background, can't help but write their background into their story. The point of view that your original factory setting is going to get into your art, regardless of whether you want it to or not. For a long time, I was writing and people thought it was super weird, and I could not figure out why.
Interesting. Just because of the outside of the culture pieces, or?
Because I was writing from my own viewpoint, and people told me, this is really good, but it's odd. There's something about the point of view that's weird. And I see what you're saying, and I totally, you know, I get into these characters, but there's just something 20 degrees off of how, you know, your worldview is.
Right.
25 degrees off center. And I'm like, no, it's perfectly centered. I'm right. You're slightly off. But I realized, you know, I came to realize that it was that worldview that I'd been brought up with. And I didn't want to go to the mainstream worldview, but I wanted to people to, you know, I wanted to, it's hard to have these nuanced conversations and to say to publishers, yeah, this is not the point of view that you're expecting. And I know you, and I appreciate that you like my writing. I really do. And I appreciate that you see the value in what I'm doing. However, my Comanche worldview is going to remain my Comanche worldview.
Right.
You know, we don't all have to have that mainstream way of seeing the world.
Right.
And that's, I mean, and I'm saying this was my experience and the conversations that I had prior to, starting to have some success, and which kind of, for me, coincided with the explosion, let us say, of indigenous futurism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what have you been reading all my life?
Right, well, exactly, right? And so I want to say, for you, then you would imagine that this is, or not even imagine, that the framing is really, given your background, that it's Comanche futurisms. That you are a Comanche futurist.
I am a Comanche futurist, yes.
Excellent. So what are for Comanche futurisms, what are some of those significant markers, right? Like, what would you say are the defining traits? And especially since you're the person that can categorize them, because you're the only like multiply published Comanche futurist that I know. And not to say that there are other published, but in this particular genre. So you get to make this all up right now, if you don't have any answers. How would you define it? How would you define Comanche futurisms? What are the markers? What are the indicators for something like that?
Well, I would say probably there are a couple of things that reoccur in my work. I know that polyamory comes up because we were historically people, a lot of anthropologists who frequently have been historically, their view has been shaped by their own experience and worldview and expectations, represent us as polygamists, but we were polyamorous, and women also had multiple husbands, so as well as men having multiple wives. And so this does pop up in my work. Other beings that are not human, being people, beings who are not human, being people too. I would also say consequences. Actions having consequences and are a big thing. And also gift economies, because we traditionally had a gift economy where instead of gaining status by hoarding goods, you gain status by giving things away, which is traditional for us. We still have big giveaways. This is important. So I tend to work gift economies into my writing, and in some of my larger works that I'm, wrestling with and trying to get wrestling with getting out there. That's a really important aspect. Trying to teach the poor benighted mainstream about that there are that and how also the lack of dichotomies. That's a real European world, is seeing everything as a dichotomy, as a black or white, right or wrong, rather than everything is nuanced to us. Everything is nuanced for us. Some things are very right, some things are very wrong, but you always see the shades in between, and how what's good for one person may not be so good, when you see it from another point of view, may not be so fabulous.
There's a nice set right there. That's a good setup. And I think it's also really interesting to kind of, think of how when we think of how that connects back to not only the cultural aspect, but listening to you talk about how that connects up back to like these characters and these beings and these, these ideas and concepts, right, that come in from traditional stories, or that come in from, more of these, I'll say, traditional learning, but really they're the blood memory, the residual knowledge, right? The post-colonial knowledge, pre to post. It's the stuff that made it across, right? That I think is really fascinating when we think about how we're then transmitting that into the future, and I won't say essentializing it, but categorizing it, right? With multiple keywords instead of just two, right? Instead of just one, Native American, well, there's a lot of things that are going on, which I think breaking outside of the dichotomy. So why, I think, you've set the terms and this definition. Why are Indigenous futurisms important? Like, what's the Comanche futurisms? Futurisms. We'll go deep. I don't know. How would you translate futurisms? Oh, we got to find that word. And then that's going to be even better. We're going to do it all language from now on, next time.
How and why isn't our tribal linguist on this? Anyway, why isn't she one of the people here? I can just grab her and say, Catherine, what would you call that? I know
Catherine, and that'd be awesome. You totally need to tell that to Catherine. Just be like, how do you translate this? Yep. So
what I would say is monoculture, ideas translate. Nothing happens in a vacuum. And in agriculture, monoculture is deadly. It is destructive to the soil, which is destructive to the planet. I don't know if you know this, but carbon is essential to the health of the soil, and that's where it belongs instead of the air. And monoculture is one of the ways that winds up in the air rather than in the soil, and is anyway. So I would say monoculture, whether it's livestock, whether it's growing corn for livestock feed, whether it is social, is destructive and unnatural. And if you have just one way of thinking, if you have just one point of view, you have no ability to deal with all kinds of problems if you only have one way of looking at those problems. And for a long time, because European thinking has been so dominant, the culture has really, the society has really gotten itself in a hole by only thinking of, only European style thinking is correct and acceptable and valuable. And they've really cut themselves off from a lot of potential solutions, and really caused a lot of social issues. Social issues, technological issues, ecological issues, for this very reason, because you can't just have one way of thinking. And nothing transmits a way of thinking quicker and disperses it throughout society better than storytelling. Nomina Futurisms is a Trojan horse to kind of undo the missionaries and the residential schools, and now we're getting our thoughts and our ideas to your children. We're getting our thoughts and our ideas to mainstream society. And so that's why I think Nomina Futurisms is important as a movement. Now we need more Nom to start writing these stories. Because every band was different. I don't know, some tribes are more centralized, but because we had so many bands, and they all had different influences, and they all had took in different non-noms and made them noms, and some quite happily, and some maybe less.
Not as happily, because you're just gonna have to do it. You just say it. So
some voluntarily, some less voluntarily.
yep.
But I, so we all had different influences, and we were all, like my band that I came from was heavily matriarchal and heavily matrilineal. Some other bands weren't that way, and so it really varied.
Right.
Right. So it's, we're all different, but yeah. Maybe we need to go further. Maybe I need to say what I write are Weyodi Futurisms.
So even
I'm narrowing
right.
it further. I'm narrowing it further down because we're all different.
Yeah. And I think that brings up, that when we talk about these broad terminologies, right? I mean, we're saying Indigenous futurisms as a category so that we can have a light grouping of things, but essentially we are talking about each of these as individual strands, right? Because there's not as much of a rule book for Indigenous, we'll say like futurism / science fiction. Whereas a lot of that was set into canon for, Western writers back in the turn of the century, right? And then leading into the 30s, 40s, 50s, right? So like coming out of that, popularizing that. And there was an established kind of way, right? That it had to be written. We'll put "had" in quotes. And coming into this is this is sort of a brand new identity, right? What is Indigenous futurisms? I mean, we know what Grace Dillon has postulated and put the sort of the formalized components together, but then each of those components has the individualized cultural strands, I think, that make up of that. So you can talk about slipstream, or you can talk about dystopia, or you can talk about post-apocalypse, or you can talk about all of the very, I think the 6 or 7 various things, sustainability and ag, and everything that Dr. Dillon lays out. But each one of those is still in definition, right? Which I think is it's adaptive, which is what Vine Deloria talks about. What is the concept of indigeneity? What is the concept or the definition of indigenous? Well, it's adaptive. It's constantly kind of changing. It is, it's moving. It's organic in and of itself. And I think that, you're speaking even in real time. You're like, we should call it this. Well, actually, you should probably call it this. And you're starting to bring it down as you're a representative, but all of these little strands are coming in, and you're weaving this beautiful thing that we're now calling, blank futurisms, right? Indigenous in brackets, and then futurisms with it, right? I think I honestly think that's probably the best way that we can frame it,
Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting when you go back and you're looking at historically early science fiction, because you have this kind of colonial science fiction with H.G. Wells and Jules Verne that took a very colonial European kind of point of view. But then later you got this very, I would say, with guys like C.M. Cornbluth, and who is one of my favorites. You got this very kind of outsider point of view, and it's not really shocking because that these guys who really pioneered this kind of in mainstream science fiction, but it was that had this different viewpoint where the protagonist was an outsider who was kind of to a degree, a marginalized person. And these guys were all the children of Jewish immigrants who came from places where their parents had been, their grandparents and their parents maybe had been under threat of death. who had, lived under, in a place where they were kind of these marginalized people. There were laws against what they could and couldn't do. So, and then they came and they still found, there were quotas in the universities, and that these guys who were smart guys, who were capable guys, that this translated into their work.
Mm-hmm.
But it was still a settler kind of mentality.
Right.
It was still found its way in there.
Right.
And I think that's still another strand of futurism and science fiction in general. Well,
and a lot of it being very techno-authoritarian, right? Like the technologists being the definers within the space, and that technology being the center and central point to existence, right? Which leads to some great philosophical approaches. I was just thinking, it was funny because I went back and watched, you said Jules Verne, and I went back and was watching Disney 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Well, what's fascinating about it, I was sitting there watching it, because it's been years since I was a kid, and I'm watching it. Basically, Nemo is like, who's destroying the earth? Humans. So I'm going to get rid of humans because they're destroying everything under the sea, except for me, because I'll be the last one around. But I'm going to destroy everybody else. I'm just going to blow all this stuff up. And I was like, well, interestingly enough, he's the villain in the story, but he's not entirely wrong. I mean, I don't necessarily know about the ends, but I'm definitely he's like, well, yeah, humans are pretty well destroying the ocean way back in the 1800s. Or Burns' version of the, future, wherever he was, right? So I find that incredibly striking. And then how technology will obviously be the salvation. And it's very interesting to watch how that flips too, right? As we start building technology, and as technology starts gaining this sort of, this focal point in our society, how it starts to turn, right? It's no longer the thing that's going to be able to take care of us. It's the thing that's going to destroy us instead, right? So,
as opposed to community based,
right.
I mean, which is what you see in and that I think is another part for me of Nemina Futurisms is seeing things as the whole, it's really weird, this idea of humans as separated from nature. It's a real strange European idea. And, but it was funny because I was just talking to my, we had our yearly kind of horror movie marathon of the last week. And we went through all kinds of, we watched Wicker Man and Blackula and, all kinds, my favorites. And it's funny, we were talking about how so many of them aren't really horror movies. And Young Frankenstein is a parenting movie. If you just love your child enough, it'll be okay. And they're these weird monsters who bite people and are afraid of fire, but if you love them enough, they'll turn out. And that's the point of the original Frankenstein, who was just a bad father. He was just if you're a bad dad, your kid's just going to go off the deep end.
That's right.
It's all about your point of view on these things. I mean, or, Wicker Man, how is that even a horror movie? We were just, the most horrible thing is, Christopher Lee's outfit, in the, he's sitting in front of the fire and anyway. And so it's all about point of view. But that is one of the issues is, I think one of the differences between Indigenous futurism and your mainstream science fiction is that no matter how much important the technology is or how different the technology is, it's not the center of the story. It's a device.
Right.
The people have to be, the relationships, even if there are no people in the story, between the beings in the story. One of our, the motto of our tribal college is responsibility, redistribution, and reciprocity. And I think those are probably, you know, for me, at the center of our thinking. And it's at the center of my writing, I guess, of what I do.
Right.
So maybe that's it. Maybe those are the key elements.
See, in real time, right? I was like, I'll put you on the spot, and then like
I'm riffing.
kind of making it up, and we come up with this beautiful, you know. And I think I really think that's a beautiful expansion of it, right? I think there is a part where it's not simply these framing devices that we see, but again, how it's evolving, and what are these underlying core values that we bring to our writing, that we bring as Indigenous peoples with our tribal backgrounds, the ways in which we were raised, et cetera, of what we're bringing into these spaces when we create worlds and when we write. And I think those are some key defining features. I think those are present. I think those are present in post-apocalypse stories. I think those are present in, you know, your time bending stories. They're present in your sustainability stories. They're present across all, you know, your space travel stories, right? How it's always the kind of the question we're just like, how would natives be in space, right? So, you know, I've been working on a piece where I talk about how if we say we're indigenous to something and then we have to leave that something, what does that mean? Right? If we're no longer in the space, or potentially we're bound to a different space, or there's all sorts of ways that we can reframe this for a postmodern context, right? That one, I think another part that I see that's fairly present across these things is a dehistoricization of a fetished identity, right? Of a misrepresented identity. So it's the fact that we can talk about historical stories, but it's not being like, oh, look at the noble savage and how they exist in this, you know, in this space. And, you know, it's now we put the noble savage in space, you know, Indians in space type of thing, right?
Well, as a person who is working on this currently, who is currently wrestling with Indians in space, zero G, we spin a lot. But no, I kind of have to go back again. Everything is a digression. It's kind of how our language goes to. It's funny. I was talking, one of my cousins, my 80,000 cousins, like we all have, Jason Asnap said, he was talking about how weird it is to be a num in Albuquerque, trying to when the question of land acknowledgement comes up,
right?
Because this is part of our traditional range, our band. We went through here routinely. This was part of. We have stories about it. This is part of our places we routinely went through, and yet we never farmed anything here. You know, if some people were buried here, of course, because maybe the people who lived here all the time killed us. So
yeah, just saying, Pueblo power, baby.
I know. So
sorry, no, keep going. Sorry.
So he was like, I get embarrassed. He's like, I just feel what am I supposed to say? Yes, I say this was part of our range, but the Sandia people live, you know, Sandia Pueblo, this is their home, but this is also our range.
Right.
You know,
right.
it's things and again, this goes back to there's not a dichotomy. That's not a dichotomous way of thinking. It can be our range and their home at the same time.
Right.
You guys, you Pueblo people, this is your home, but it's also ours too. So, both.
And I think that's what is, I think, there's been an interesting pushback against the land acknowledgement part, almost as becoming performative. And I think it's because, in essence, for us, we recognize that it's another essentialization of an Indigenous identity that continues to harken back to this historical, this historicization of Native identity, rather than focusing on like, hey guys, we're still literally standing here in front of you right now or we're Zooming with you. I actually get uncomfortable when people ask me to do a land acknowledgement when I'm on Zoom. I'm like, from where? Where are you talking about? Your land, my land here, the Zoomosphere? I was like, I give acknowledgement to the inventors of the internet. Like, what do we do with that, right? But I think there's something really compelling in being able to write and do Indigenous futurisms around those kinds of concepts, right? So, I mean, I am absolutely fascinated by territory and diaspora. What does it mean when you're no longer part of that homeland and you potentially displace someone else from their location? Are you Indigenous? Are you a settler? Are you part of the colonizer? It's easier to do that instead of having to answer those questions like here, because I can get you in trouble, and just put it in space, right? Be like, well, what happens when we take over Mars and there were actual Martians there already? And the native folks were like, man, peace out, we're gone from Earth. We get out of here. And then you can have your characters wrestle with these larger issues rather than having me to say just like, yeah, I'm gonna write down how the Comanche came into our territory. I was like, those are fighting words. But I don't have to do that when it's Martians, and Comanches in space. And I was like, they probably would trade with the Martians, and and they would have a huge home range territory that'd be like, oh no, we actually go out past Mars, and we got all this stuff over there too. You guys are fun. Shh, everybody just calm down.
We'll see.
Right.
But okay, we do go with
Man,
that.
you already got plans. You're like, well, we've been building rockets up there in Oklahoma, so we don't know what's going to happen.
Actually, there are Comanches working on the Artemis program.
I believe it. That's amazing.
Or a Comanche anyway, on the Artemis. But I mean, it's complicated because we're in Oklahoma on land that other people were displaced from.
Mm-hmm.
And people talk about, our homelands in Oklahoma. I'm like, those aren't our homelands. And I'm like, okay, they're not our only homelands.
Right.
Or, we have stories about those places. We went through those places, but there were also people who lived there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's complicated. It's not, it's kind of anyway, it's a different.
Yeah, and that's it. And it's the complications. And I think that, when we're thinking futurisms and whatnot, we're able to create particular constructs and parameters where we can think through them. And I think we're in many ways, what we do as writers is literally what we're doing right now, which is we're kind of like thinking through the concept and the topic in the writing, because we don't know where it's going to land, right? You don't quite know how it's going to play out, but let's put some characters in there and shake the box up, see what happens, right?
Absolutely. And I also do a thing where I do sometimes use traditional stories and I kind of shift them around a little bit, or not even traditional stories, but real stories. From my, people I knew that deserve to be in space, or like we have a traditional story that belongs to my family, because different families own different stories. How that goes.
Yeah.
That belongs in my family is the story. There's a white dog that belongs to a little girl with the power to enter other dimensions. Because the idea of other dimensions is a traditional Numina concept. We were, way before the Europeans came, we were thinking about other dimensions and other realities, and that was a concept that we had. And it's a traditional story about a dog who has this kind of power, and who winds up he's in the space Comanche story, in the big space Comanche story. And also, my great uncle had a pet baboon, and
Brilliant.
he had a pet baboon,
Yep. Why not?
As they do, keeping a baboon out there in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
In his painting studio.
Yep.
Hanging out, listening to Santana with a baboon while he painted.
Yep. Brilliant.
As one does.
Yep. Well, and it's brilliant to see because I think a lot of this stuff, interdimensionality, these types of things, because they don't conform to the Western narrative of the savage, of the backward, indigeneity is. I mean, you see it actually. It's another. I mean, you see that same sort of interdimensionality in the mapas from like the Azteca and the Comanche and the folks in central and northern Mexico. They were playing around with that same kind of thing through illustrations. There's one there's an illustration for, it's the Mapa de Comanche Número 2, I think, and there's a little tiny character on the side where they've drawn it, and he's coming through a tear in the paper. And the character is actually coming through the paper in a way that no other characters have been represented. And it's one of the things that, the academics, when the scholars, were kind of looking at this, is like, this is fascinating. They have this concept of breaking the fourth wall through either an interdimensionality, that there's something even behind the paper or beyond where this art is coming from. So I think in many ways, Native peoples have brought some incredible brilliance to these spaces quite often, and especially in these fascinating futurisms. We're getting close to time. Let me ask you a question. No, you got one more. What do you want to say?
I wanted to jump in there and say that Nawa are our relatives. If you didn't know that, so you can see how it's all interrelated. But yes. Anyway, go on.
I was going to say, since we're getting close, but it's now recommendation time. So what should we be, what to get our heads either around fascinating futurisms or really good science fiction, what do you recommend for us?
Oh my gosh. Now I would have had dozens of things, and then you asked me and I go.
Yeah, I'll sing a little bit.
There's a blue screen now.
Futurism, fascinating futurism. That's what we'll do. That's what we're talking about. I was hoping that would help, but I think it just made you laugh more.
You just made it worse. Okay.
Well, I will recommend plenty of your work out there. I know you've got some indie books, some titles. What else have you got coming up that's coming into this world? That's, if it's not already there.
Well, the formerly indie titles are being released through ePulp in 2022.
Excellent.
ePulp Press, The Root and the Seed and the Thief in Between, The Burning Lie, and The Bees Made Honey and the Rich Man's Skull. Those are going to be coming out. And you can, there's my story in a Howl anthology, Wowoken, which is kind of my retelling of my fictionalized retelling of actual events in the 20s, and my contribution to the Water Protectors legal collective, and coming out in 2022, and Coyote Crow. Although everyone else in the world says Coyote, I just, you know what? it was, it's a weird thing of mine. I just say coyote.
I'm just gonna say, so as a New Mexican, as a Pueblo, what are you doing? You pronounce the E. It's an E. It's at the end of it. Okay? Listen, you don't say just chill. It's Chile. Okay? You say coyote.
Well, see, growing up in Oklahoma, being named Weyodi, I was like, they were ahead of the curve there. Everybody else had English names. Mm-hmm. I was the only kid around, at that time with a Comanche name and no English name to fall back on. And I got teased in school as Weyodi Coyote.
Okay.
And so
you get okay. Okay. Fair enough.
That makes sense.
Fair enough. Yeah. Let it be.
So I have my own. It's a weird little.
Got your own story. There's your own little thread for that. So you get your pass.
I get my pass. I get my coyote pass.
You get your coyote pass. You're good to go. Well, that's really good because we have Connor coming up. So we'll get to talk with him about coyote and crow.
He says coyote.
I know what he says. I'm helping you out as we close this out. I want to say thank you so much for chatting with me. It's always such a joy. We get to do it on Zoom. We get to hopefully do it more in person. We'll be looking forward to all the great stuff that you've got coming out. And if anybody out there that's been watching either live or when you catch this later and you want more fascinating Futurisms, there's so many great places to check online. We want to say thank you to New Mexico Humanities Council and all of the wonderful supporters for the National Endowment for the Humanities and all of the wonderful supporters that have allowed us to continue to do this work, to bring on these great guests and to continue to talk about these fascinating Futurisms. We've got a couple more coming up, so you can find these on our home at A Tribe Called Geek. We got lots of links. We'll link to Weyodi's work. We'll link to all the other things that are coming in. So check it out. Weyodi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Lee. I've had a great time.
You are a delight as always. So thank you, everybody. We'll say goodnight and close it out, and we will catch up soon. Take care. Be safe, be well, be wonderful, and have all your Indigenous Futurisms ahead of you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.